Hi, Bob Kalechman here for Millennium. Today I think we have a special treat, and however, before we go into that, I'd like to mention to you the certificate in appreciation that I received from the Daughters of the American Revolution regarding my service and my Marine Corps service and my service to the town and to its veterans. And it's a certificate of appreciation, and it was presented to Robert Kalechman, your host, and it was presented by the Abigail Phelps chapter. And I cherish this very much, being that that the Daughters of the American Revolution, who've been serving veterans and people of war for over 300, 400 years, going back to the French and Indian War, it's really appreciated. And I appreciate it, and I can assure you my family appreciates it. And I certainly hope that the leaders of our town appreciate my service. I don't see too many of them at the cemetery or at the cemetery when we pay tribute to our dead veterans or dead servicemen. Well, saying that, I would like to discuss with you today the horrific action in the Pacific War and World War II in retaliation to the Japanese and the Japanese brutality to the American men and women in our services. And I also have to mention the brave Filipino people who served under the flag of the United States in defending their country and defending the United States. I like to take my hat off to them, because they took their lives in their hands by just helping an American. Just throwing them a piece of sugar cane meant death. But they did it, and they took the chances. So today we're going to discuss the invasion of the Philippines in 1941, the Battle of Bataan, and of course the defense of Corregidor, which was known in the Pacific as the Rock, the Gibraltar of the Pacific was Corregidor. And the reason I mention Corregidor more or less favorably is because the 4th Marine Corps Regiment, which had been stationed in Shanghai, China, was pulled out of Shanghai and sent to Corregidor. And their job was to defend the island of Corregidor. And they were the last defense regarding the Philippines. There were spontaneous defenses of the other islands, but the ending defense was the Corregidor, and the last defense was the Marine Corps 4th Regiment that defended that island. And that was the island that MacArthur left from, was Corregidor. And the Marines had a song, and it wasn't out of disrespect, but in the Marine Corps, we never leave our men, we never leave our dead, we never leave our wounded, and our commitment and given promise to our men and to our Corps is that we'll never leave you. We take you with us. And that's what we did at Corregidor. So we had a song, or the Marine Corps had a song, in regards to Dugout Doug. And there's where he got his name from, because when he left the island, he had to leave in a boat to get to the submarine that would take him to Australia. So the Marine Corps divulged a little ditty called Dugout Doug. And it followed him all through his career. It wasn't out of disrespect. It was just out of a reminder that Marines don't leave their men. So now we'll get to the references and such. And the Battle of the Philippines, the Battle of Bataan, was 1942, and there were 76,000 prisoners taken. They were both Filipino and American. Prisoners of war, the Battle of Bataan. Some 64,000, I'm wrong, there were 76,000 Americans, and there were 64,000 Filipinos, soldiers, that served in the American Army. And they serve to this day in the American Army. And what they acquire by serving in the American Armed Forces is that when they serve the America, they get American citizenship, and they get an American passport, and they're free to travel back and forth to America. And if they're wounded, they receive benefits from the American VA. They're members of the Veterans Administration. 12,000 U.S. soldiers then were forced to endure what came to be known as the Battle to Death March. And that was a horrific, brutal march. And in this march, I have to mention to you that along the way, if a Filipino were to offer a glass of water or a cup of water or a coconut or a piece of sugar cane, they were shot or bayoneted on the spot by the Japanese soldiers. And these were orders that came down from the commander-in-chief. His name was Homo. And oddly enough, when it came time for his death, he was a war criminal, and when it came time for the rape of Manila and such that he was commanding soldiers to, and he was tried and convicted, he asked to be, they sentenced him to be hung. And he felt that being a samurai, that he wanted to be shot. And MacArthur said, absolutely not, and MacArthur hung him, rightly so. And that's how that trial was handled. There were a few others that were more or less used at the Nuremberg trial to get commuted sentences for the Nazi or the German war criminals, but it worked slightly, and that was because of a naval commander or whatever. And the reference books are the U.S. Salutes Filipino Vets, and that's by a Roy C. Mabasa. And the other book is Corregidor, the American Alamo of World War II. That's a good title. And Irving Alexander wrote a book in 205, Surviving Bataan and Beyond. And these were the accounts of Colonel Ivan Alexander Odysseus, and he was a prisoner of war. And other sources were James Robinson, and I guess, and further reading would be The Fall of the Philippines by Martin Lewis. Now, the background of the Filipino action was crucial to the Imperial Japanese Army's effort to continue the Southwest Pacific Sea's resources. And it must be remembered that the Japanese had gone through Malaya, they had gone through the Dutch East Indies, they had gone through Singapore in a matter of days, and these were designed defenses that were supposed to last months and years. And that's how effective the Japanese soldier was. However, when he came to the Philippines, the tenacity of the American soldier and the Filipino proved unwavering. And it took them quite a while to come down, though they did it in a short period of time. Because they invaded in December of 41, and then we go into April 42, we have Bataan, and then May of 42, we have the fall of Corregidor, which a lot of Marines will say we never gave it up. But nevertheless, it was, and oddly enough, the first 2 or 3 attacks by the Japanese Air Force, which was done, and you have to bear in mind that in Hawaii, the timeline is such, but when you get to the Philippine Islands, they're lagging hours and possibly days behind. So December 7th in Hawaii would be December 6th in the Philippines, and there would be a time lag. So the attack in Hawaii would be before the attack in the Philippines. They weren't done together. And the point was that the American Air Force was caught with their pants down in Clark Field and the other places. And what was left of the United States Army Air Force at the time was they made a good accounting. What planes they could salvage, they put in the air, and they managed to damage the Japanese flagship Nagoya, which was a battleship, and they managed to damage a couple destroyers. They sunk a minesweeper. And from 8 to 10 December, it was a scattered resistance from the Air Force. And then what happened with the Air Force, they were just assimilated into the ground forces, which around these bases, there wasn't that much. Now, I had a cousin that was captured at Clark Field, and he was marched to a prison camp, and he died of dysentery. And it's difficult to think to being in a war and you die of dysentery, not a bullet or shrapnel or concussion, but dysentery. But that was the conditions that these men and women were forced to live under the courtesy of the Imperial Japanese government. And I'd like to remind you that our influential senators, both Murphy and Senator Blumenthal, they're spending an awful lot of time race baiting people, turning one race against the other and stirring the pot, so to speak. They haven't raised one finger to see that these fellas that served as these prisoners of war, that served as slave labor to the Japanese army and the Japanese government, never were paid, never received any wages. They never received one dime. A lot of them worked in mines. A lot of them worked in fields. A lot of them worked in fields and were killed, murdered, and to this day they haven't received one nickel. And let me remind you, the aging of our World War II veteran is not, it's not a young age anymore. Most of them have to be up in the 90s, unless you have one or two that lied about their age. But in most cases, they're all up there. And they haven't received one nickel for the slave labor, or their families haven't received one nickel. Another thing I like to mention is that when people think of the Philippines, the first thing they think of is Douglas MacArthur, General Douglas MacArthur. General Douglas MacArthur was a military genius. Whether you agreed with him or not, he was a military genius. In his own right, he was a genius. Here's a man that developed the invasion of Incheon, an impossible feat. But the American naval forces and Marines accomplished it. An impossibility, right? The impossible we do right away. The improbable takes a little time. Well, this is what the Marine Corps delivered to General MacArthur, the military genius. A landing that was totally impossible, the Marine Corps achieved at Incheon. And inside of 4 or 5 days, the 1st Marine Division was in Seoul. And we saved a lot of lives. Now, the generals involved in Bataan and Corregidor, a lot of people talk about General Douglas MacArthur, who was the commanding general of all forces, and Jonathan Wainwright, the subsequent commander of all forces in Bataan and Corregidor. But very few people know or ever heard of the name of King, General King. He was another commanding general And I like to give him a lot of credence because this was a general. He didn't serve from the back. He didn't serve from the bomb-proof shelters on Corregidor. He served up front with his men. It was not uncommon to see him walking a trail in Bataan with a Springfield rifle. And oddly enough, a lot of us are led to believe that in Bataan, the only rifle that the American and Filipino forces carried was a Springfield. That's not the case. There were American regiments that were equipped with M1s. A lot of people aren't aware of that, but the Army had M1s in the Philippines, and some Marine Corps units had it. But in the long short of it, the Marines took Guadalcanal with a Springfield 03. And then slowly the M1 was phased in. And basically the difference between the M1 and the Springfield are the sights. They have a leaf sight on the Springfield. They have a peep sight on the M1. The Springfield can 5-6 rounds possibly if you have one in the chamber. The M1, 8 rounds, possibly 9 rounds if you have one in the chamber. But on the M1, I think you're probably, you probably have a clip which is 8, and the Springfield which is 5, and the M1, when you put the M1 clip in, the clip flops out, and which is true on the Springfield too. But on the M1, as soon as you pull your finger out, the receiver closes. On the Springfield, you have to close it manually. So that was that weapon. But Major General Edward King, he was the commander on the ground. And of course, the enemy commander was Homo. And it took them two offensives to get down into Bataan from the onset. And General Homo had estimated that the final offensive would require a week to breach what they call the Orano-Baga line, and a month of liquidations, 2 final defense lines he believed he had prepared on Bataan. When the opening attack required just 3 days, he pushed his forces on April 6th to meet expected counterattacks head-on. The Japanese landed a drive into the center, penetrated into the flanks, held by the 22nd and the 23rd Regiments of the 21st Division, captured Mount Samat and outflanked all of the Corps. What happened was a natural defense line was like a mountain, and the Japanese army outflanked it rather than try to take it on head on, which in those days, warfare was usually a frontal assault. But now the Japanese, which rarely did a flanking movement, you heard of kamikaze, that's a frontal attack. That's not a flanking attack. And they launched a drive and penetrated the flanks. The drives into the center had no effect. And outflanked the U.S. Army, like I said. The 57th Infantry gained any ground soon lost. All along the battlefront, units of the I Corps, together with the devastated remnants of the Second Corps, crumbled and staggered to the rear. The commander en battalion lost all contact with their units, except by runners. And in other words, your communications were wire or radio. But figured in 42, radios weren't that reliable, so they did what they call wire. Wire is a wire, and two, it's just like, as a kid, have you ever taken string and tied it to two cans, and you're talking to the can, and the fella on the other side can hear the talk through the string? Basically, this is the same thing with wire communications. You have two phones which are sound activated, and they're hooked up to two wires. And it's oddly, people are talking about, here again I mentioned dysentery. It's odd that you speak that way, because when you're in the Pacific, the temperature and humidity is such that you end up in a situation where it's unbearable, and you have to more or less make sure that you drink plenty of water. These fellas that didn't have water and couldn't drink it and were running wire, they ended up where they would die from the heat. So these are the situations that you run into. Now, I want to devote a minute or two towards my candidacy. My name's Robert Kalechman. I'm running as unaffiliate for First Selectman. It's a very difficult task to undertake, being that you have to fight them all every way. You fight them for position on the voting ballot, and they don't give it to you until the very last minute. And in most cases, when they do give it to you, you're at the very bottom of the ballot. So when you look for me, it's Robert Kalechman, and you'll have to look at the very bottom of the ballot, probably along the C line, and then you'll see my name. So if you'll kindly take the time to locate my name and more or less fill it in. And because of the attitude of the parties in the town that count the ballots, you have to do the ballot meticulously, because you have to fill in the circle just right. Because if you do it with a check or an X or whatever, if the monitor decides that he's not going to allow the vote because your name is Robert Kalechman and you're an unaffiliate, you don't be counted. I've run into it already as far as the announcements in the paper. I'm being totally treated unfairly, because they're not telling people that I'm on the ballot. They mention the Republican ticket, they mention the Democratic ticket. And this is all done under the leadership of the Democratic Party. They're heading the operation at Town Hall. So kindly look for Robert Kalechman, and I kindly would appreciate your vote. And if you want to see change, and it's time, now's the time to do it. Thank you very much for allowing me into your home. I appreciate the time that you allowed me to address you, and I certainly hope you take to heart our veterans who served on battalion, and make sure that our government takes proper care of them. Thank you very much. God bless you.